So the last couple classes we've been talking about the theory of utilitarianism. And what I've tried to do is to explain the main principle to which the utilitarians adhere, which is the principle of utility. And this principle says that actions are right insofar as they produce aggregate happiness and wrong insofar as they produce aggregate pain. And what I've tried to do is demonstrate that this theory is somewhat intuitive. I think we use it in many day-to-day kinds of decisions, very simple decisions sometimes, and even more serious decisions like what we've seen when we talk about how decisions are made when it comes to warfare. Sometimes we'll have to sacrifice a handful for the sake of the greater good. We've also seen how the utilitarians reason about a good number of more controversial issues. Things such as the legalization of marijuana, or for instance, we talked about what a utilitarian would say about capital punishment, our duties to our ethical obligations to animals, or our ethical obligations to help those who are suffering in dire conditions in third world countries. And I think the theory of utilitarianism, it does seem plausible to a good many people, and it's actually been a very important and influential theory in the last 100 plus years. And in some sense, even before that, even before it had a name, you'll see philosophers and you'll see people make decisions on the basis of whether or not that decision is going to lead to greater overall happiness or produce more overall pain. There's just something intuitive and right about this theory. Nonetheless, it does have some problems, and what we're going to do in this class is we're going to look at some of the bigger problems with utilitarianism. And what we're going to really be trying to do is push on the principle of utility and ask, what does this principle entail? What actions must it lead to and justify as morally right? I had said in the last class, or the last couple classes, that the principle of utility, it doesn't square with every single moral belief that we happen to have, and that's okay to a certain extent. If it lines up with our shared core morality, as long as it lines up with that, then it might very well be an acceptable theory. We'll have to look at some other things to judge in total, but at least it has to line up with those shared core moral beliefs. If it pushes our beliefs that are on the periphery a little bit, the ones we're not so certain about, collectively or individually, then the theory is not as problematic. But what we're going to see is that the principle of utility, when taken to its logical consequences, it doesn't seem to line up with our shared core morality. In fact, it seems like it's going to justify some things that appear to be very immoral to us. And so if it justifies things that appear to us to be quite immoral, then that seems to be a big strike against the theory of utilitarianism. So before we get to these examples where the theory of utilitarianism really seems to press against our shared core morality, I want to remind you of an example we looked at before. And hopefully you remember this from a few classes ago. We talked about the trolley car experiment. And in this experiment, just to remind you, basically what's going on is you have this trolley car and the brakes on it have been dismantled. And if you do absolutely nothing, this trolley car is going to bear down on this track and kill these 5 innocent people. If you throw the switch here, however, it'll divert the path of the trolley car down this path. It'll save these 5, but it'll end up killing just this one person. And many people feel that the appropriate thing to do in this situation is to throw the switch. Why? Because it would produce less pain and suffering in the world. That seems to be certainly what a utilitarian would say. You kill the one, you save the 5. And so in this case, the theory of utilitarianism, it seems to line up with some intuitions that we oftentimes see people express or share. Now, not everybody always agrees with this thought experiment. I've encountered a number of people who would say they would do nothing and just allow the 5 to die. And, that might be, to some people that sounds preposterous and crazy, but it really isn't. And I can understand why somebody would say that, but what I've experienced is the vast majority of people, probably 80 to 90%, would say you throw the switch. And so here we see that utilitarianism does appear to align with what is our shared core moral beliefs. But I want you to put this in kind of the back of your mind for a second, and I want to share with you another thought experiment that's very, very similar to this one. So let's suppose that you go to the doctor's office just for a routine visit. You have to get your yearly checkup, and so you go to the doctor, and the doctor looks at you, and the doctor determines that you are in perfect health. The doctor says, you know what, you are a specimen of physical fitness. I've never seen anyone the likes of you. You are just perfect health. And you say, well, that's fantastic, doc. I'm glad to hear that. The doctor then tells you, well, I have some other patients I need to go check on really quickly. I'll be right back. And so the doctor steps out of the room you're in. And as you know, you've probably been to the doctor, and whenever the doctor steps out, it seems like they're gone for hours. You know, it's like you don't know where they are, what they're doing. I think they're just messing with you, but that's my opinion. But so the doctor's gone for a while. You don't think much of it. You're just sitting there playing on your phone, you know, figuring out what you're going to do for the rest of the day. And the doctor has 5 other patients, and she goes to look at them. And each one of these patients is on death's door, and each patient needs an organ in order to live. One patient needs a heart, one needs a liver, one needs a new kidney, another one needs a kidney, and we'll say one needs a new lung. And so the doctor is just stressed out about this. The doctor is distraught because 5 patients are about to die. There's no way that they can be saved. There are no organs nearby. They're all about to die. And then the doctor looks at your chart, and the doctor notices that just through some kind of medical miracle, you happen to be the world's universal organ donor. And that the doctor realizes that what she can do is that she can come in the room, and she could kill you, and she could harvest your organs and save these 5 people. She could just come in with a needle and say something to you like, hey, you need a booster shot for tetanus, and stick you in the arm with it, inject you, and then knock you out, kill you, take your organs, and save these 5 patients. Now I want you to stop here and think about this for a second. And I want you to think, does this seem like something the doctor should do? I'm curious, how many of you would agree with this? Do you think the doctor should kill you to take your organs and save 5 people? My experience has been everybody thinks this is wrong. I've never met a single person, or maybe one out of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, who says the doctor should kill you and take your organs. Even if we're not talking about you, if it's just some random Joe Schmo you've never heard of, no one ever says, yeah, the doctor should kill you and take your organs. There seems something very immoral about this. And this raises a good question, because we have to ask, well, what would the utilitarians say about it? And at least at a first pass, it seems like what the utilitarian would say is, if it produces more happiness overall, then the doctor should kill you. It seems like what the utilitarian would say would be exactly what the utilitarian would say in this situation. You kill 1, you save 5. And now you might say, and I oftentimes hear people say, let me back up here again. They say, yeah, but, sorry, let me move forward here. What I oftentimes hear people say is that, yeah, but the 5 patients who are each about to die, you know, they're going to die anyway. They're gonna die, and they're on death's door, so to speak. And the thing to say in response to that is, but the same thing was true of the 5 who were on the train tracks. The trolley car was barreling down on them, and if you did nothing, if you just stood by passively, they were going to die. And it's the exact same scenario going on here. If you do nothing, these 5 patients are going to die. Your alternative is you kill one other person, and that is, you throw the switch, right? Or you shoot them with the needle in the arm and knock them out. You throw the switch and you kill 1 and you save 5. And you know, this is kind of I know this is kind of a contrived scenario here, and some of you might be thinking this could never happen. And fair enough, it really couldn't. But you can hopefully see what the principle of utility would lead someone to do, or lead someone to believe. For a utilitarian, at least at a first pass, like I'm saying, at least initially what it seems like their view is committed to is that if you were in a situation like this, which probably would never arise, but if you were, you should kill one person, take their organs, and then save 5 other people. Why? Because it would lead to overall happiness. It's very, very similar to the trolley car thought experiment. Like I said, some of you might be rolling your eyes, and some of you might be thinking, oh my gosh, here these philosophers go again with these silly thought experiments. But I want to give you a kind of real-world example of something very much like this. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of what are called the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, but these were a set of clinical experiments that were performed over a very long period of time, about a 40-year period of time in Tuskegee, Alabama, from 1932 to 1972. And basically what was going on in these experiments is doctors were testing the long-term effects of syphilis on African Americans. And what they did is they weren't even honest with the people who were in this experiment as to why they were being tested. They told the participants that they were being tested for bad blood. But basically what they were doing is they were watching people slowly die from syphilis. So people would come in, the doctors would study them and say, okay, this is what's going on, we're giving you treatments, but the treatments were all just made up. They weren't really treating the patients. They told the patients they were being treated, but they were just watching them die. And the reason they did this is basically they offered a straightforward utilitarian rationale. They said that what they wanted to do was study these people so they could learn how you could manage pain for people who were suffering from syphilis. That way, in the long run, they could maybe help more people. So their expressed intentions in doing this experiment was basically utilitarian. It's like, hey, we're going to subject these handful of people to a medical experiment without their full knowledge of what's going on. We're going to manipulate these people. In some cases, they even lied to them and obstructed their efforts to seek medical treatments elsewhere, because the people realized, like, hey, we know that this treatment isn't working. We want to go somewhere else. And the doctors told them that they couldn't. The doctors lied to them in these kinds of experiments. And so basically the doctors were watching these people slowly die so they could gain information which they thought would prove useful in the long run. And this experiment is even more messed up than what I've just explained to you, because along the way of testing or subjecting these people to this experiment, doctors actually discovered a cure for syphilis. The cure is just penicillin. Antibiotics cures it. But the doctors didn't administer it to these patients because they thought that this information they were going to get would be so valuable in the long run. And in fact, a number of doctors, the way they viewed it is that this was probably the last batch of people who were going to have syphilis, so it was all the more important to study the long-term effects so they could have important scientific knowledge moving forward. Again, this is something very similar to the previous example of going to the doctor's office, like I was saying, primarily because what we see here is we see doctors experimenting on people, subjecting them to an experiment without their full knowledge and full disclosure. Why? For the greater good, because they thought it would produce more happiness in the end. And this is something that it seems like, again, at least at a first pass, the utilitarian would say, well, if it produced more good, then why not subject people to medical experiments? What if it produced more good overall to round up homeless people off the street and sever their spine so you could perform spinal surgery on them? What if that led to more overall happiness in the end? It seems like a utilitarian would say, go for it, you should do it. If it leads to more happiness in the end, then anything in principle could be justifiable. But this doesn't seem right. An ethical theory which tells you could experiment on people against their wills seems immoral. Now, there's nothing wrong with experimenting on people if you let them know up front and they agree to it. There's nothing wrong with it. I had friends who actually would go and earn an income by subjecting themselves to medical experiments. They'd go to these trials, and I think one of them, he tested inhalers for a week and he got paid like $2,000. But he signed off on a waiver form and he understood what the purpose of it was and he agreed to it and he wanted his money. But if you're forcing people into a medical experiment, that's an entirely different matter. And I think many people would find that as something that's just immoral, something you don't do. Utilitarianism seems to imply that you can, and in fact you're morally required to do it. So this seems to be a case where the theory of utilitarianism cuts against our deeply held moral beliefs. Let me give you a few more examples of this. So we had talked about criminal punishment before, and remember when we talked about criminal punishment, we said that for a utilitarian, the only thing that matters for them is that the punishment maximizes overall happiness. If when you punish someone, if it produces a greater social benefit, then that's the reason to do it. If it doesn't, then you shouldn't punish someone. For the utilitarian, they're not concerned about what a person deserves. They're only concerned about, will this punishment produce more happiness in the end? Now, here's the thing about that. That sounds all well and good, and a lot of people have said that this is the only sound policy that we should adopt as a country that punishes people. A lot of people have argued, utilitarians and even some non-utilitarians, have said that this idea of punishing people because of what they deserve is just this, barbaric, bloodthirst for revenge. The only reason we should punish people is if it produces greater social good, which is basically another way of saying if it maximizes happiness. But there's some problems with this, and I want to highlight these problems by asking you this. Well, what if it maximized happiness? What if it produced a greater social good to have excessively harsh punishments for crimes? For instance, what if you were caught speeding, going 5 miles over the speed limit, and you got thrown in prison for a year for it? Well, let's say you got thrown in prison for 10 years for it. Now, it might produce some greater social good. Maybe nobody would ever speed again if that were the case. Or what if you got caught jaywalking and you had your leg cut off for it? I bet there'd be a lot fewer people jaywalking. Or what if you got caught stealing and you got your hands cut off? Or what if you got caught lying and you had your tongue cut off? Or what if you got caught looking at pornography or child pornography and you had your eyes gouged out? I bet this would maximize some social benefits. I bet there'd be a lot fewer people breaking these crimes. What if you got caught, again, I don't know, cheating or something like that, and you got beaten? Or what if you got caught graffitiing and you got beaten? I bet there'd be a lot fewer people doing this. In fact, there was a case when I was in high school of some American students who went to, I want to say it was Singapore, and they graffitied some cars there. It was really dumb. I don't know why you go to another country and do something like that. And the punishment was they got beaten with the cane pole. That was the punishment. And they got beaten. Our State Department couldn't get them out of the situation. That's why people in some countries, they don't steal. That's why people in some countries, they don't, graffiti or commit crimes, because the punishments are so harsh. What if the only punishment ever for a crime was death? Do you think people would break the law? Probably not. And so here we see that the theory of utilitarianism, in a way, or in a very obvious way, it cuts against something that a lot of us believe, which is that the punishment should fit the crime. You shouldn't spend 5 years in prison for speeding. This is why a lot of people have problems with laws against marijuana, because people will spend 10 years in prison for simple possession, or they'll spend 5 years in prison for simple possession. And a lot of people feel like that's just, the punishment is disproportionate to the crime. This is why people have problems with 3 strikes and you're out laws, because you could commit 3 minor crimes, like stealing $10 on 3 separate occasions, and then spend 20 years in prison. And that makes no sense. Why, again, should you spend 20 years in prison for stealing a total of $30? Why should it matter that you did it on 3 separate occasions versus just 1? It makes no sense. So this is why a lot of people have problems with these kinds of laws, because the punishment is not proportional to the crime. But utilitarianism doesn't care about proportionality between crime and punishment. All they care about is, will the punishment lead to more social benefit? And if it does, make the punishment as severe as possible. If it leads to greater social benefit, it's irrelevant how harsh it is, as long as it makes more happiness in the world. Or what if it maximized happiness? What if it produced social benefit to punish innocent people? What if just rounding up innocent people off the streets punishing them to set an example led to greater social good? Or what if there was someone who was convicted of a crime? Suppose there had been a serial killer on the loose, and somebody was caught for it. Or suppose there had been someone who was I don't know, a killer, and somebody was caught for it, but the sheriff or the judge or whomever knew the person who was caught was actually innocent. But the people were demanding that somebody be punished for these crimes. And so what if the judge said, thinking to himself, well, I know this guy's innocent, but I need to give somebody to the people to silence the mob who's going to riot if we don't punish someone. So the judge just hands the person over to the mob and they kill him. Or the judge just goes ahead and sentences the guy to death just to silence the mob. What if punishing innocent people, and there could be cases where this could arise, led to greater overall happiness? Or what if, and this is actually kind of the case in the United States, we just had a justice system where we just threw the book at pretty much everybody who walked through the doors of the courthouse, and the reason we did that was due to the fact that we were trying to catch all the bad guys, but by focusing so much on catching the bad guys, we actually punished a lot of innocent people in the process. In fact, this has happened with the death penalty in some cases. There was a classroom at a journalism class at Northwestern in Chicago, Illinois. And probably this was about 15 years ago. As a class project, they started to investigate people who were on death row in the state of Illinois. And they found that about 10 or 15 people on death row were actually innocent of the crimes they were charged with. Some of them hadn't even been present at the scene of the crime. And so you had just this classroom of 20, 21-year-old students basically figuring out these people were innocent by doing simple things like cross-checking witnesses or various other things that should have been done. Now, some people would say in defense of criminal punishment and say, well, look, it's so important to set an example and to punish people. If a few innocent people get killed in the process, well, it's just a numbers game, basically. To me, that seems really harsh and horrible and immoral. One of the things that seems absolute worst to me is that an innocent person should be punished for something that they didn't do, especially executed. But for a utilitarian, what if it does lead to more overall social benefit to kill innocent people? They would say, go ahead and do it, as long as it leads to greater social benefit. And so here we see some ways in which the theory of utilitarianism is really at odds with our ordinary ways of thinking. It can justify some really, really horrible things. And so what the theory of utilitarianism seems to do and seems to have a major problem with is making sense of what we call basic human rights. Now, when we talk about rights, what we're talking about are what we call claims or entitlements, and there are various kinds of rights that people have. Some rights we have, these are known as legal rights, like the right to bear arms. Well, the reason you have that right is because a bunch of people got together a couple hundred years ago. They created the U.S. Constitution, and they said, we're going to give you this right. But that's the kind of right that could be taken away from you if Congress were to make an amendment to the Constitution. But there are other kinds of rights that we have that we refer to as natural rights. And these kinds of rights are described as being inalienable, meaning they can't be taken away from you. Now, people can violate these kinds of rights, but that just shows that what they've done is wrong. These kinds of rights can't be taken away from you simply as a product of people voting to remove them. These are the kinds of rights, these natural rights, human rights, are the kinds of rights you have just in virtue of being a person. You have these kinds of rights. And our Constitution actually lays this out. They say among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And there are actually many others. And it's very clear in the Constitution of the United States, and I'm just using this as an example, that they distinguish between the natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, versus the legal rights that we have. And the problem with utilitarians is they have a really hard time making sense of these natural rights that we have. Now, before I go on to give you a quotation to demonstrate just this, I need to say a little bit about duties. Duties are the flip side of rights. If I have a right to life, then you have a duty not to kill me. A lot of times they're described, duties are the co-relatives of rights. These are the opposite side of the same coin. If you have a right to something, then that imposes a duty on me. And if I have a right, that imposes a duty on you. And utilitarians, they have a really hard time of making sense of these, because these rights that we have, these human rights, they're inalienable, and they impose absolute restrictions on the way that others might treat us. And you cannot violate these rights, even if the payoff in the end is really, really, really good. That's the whole point of a right, is that it serves to protect you against the actions of others. Even in the case, and especially in the case, where violating that right would produce greater social benefit. And utilitarians actually acknowledge, they say, they're aware that their theory can't protect these basic human rights. And in fact, John Stuart Mill, he was the second guy that we had talked about as one of the founders of utilitarianism. He said just this: all persons are deemed to have a right to equality of treatment, except when some recognized social expediency requires the reverse. Now that's a very highfalutin way of saying something, but basically he's saying this: everybody has a right to equality, except when it benefits society to remove this right. You have a right to equality of treatment, except when it benefits society not to treat you with equality. Which is basically just a way of saying this: when it benefits society to treat you equally, then you're going to get treated equally. When it benefits society to not treat you equally, then you're not going to get treated equally. But that's not really a right at all. A right is supposed to exist always. It's supposed to protect you. If it's an inalienable human right, it can't be taken away just because it benefits society to mistreat you. And so, like I said, utilitarians are very, very aware that their theory cannot protect basic human rights. And this is the fundamental problem, I think, that utilitarianism has always faced, because it's so focused on the consequences of our actions, when we can always come up with reasons to mistreat people, to treat them as just objects or tools of manipulation. And that seems wrong. You might hear people say things like this, like, there are just some ways you don't treat people. I've heard people say this from time to time when maybe someone gets lied to, or someone gets mistreated or treated like just an object or a tool. You'll hear people say, you just don't do this to people. And the problem with utilitarianism, they can't ever say that. They can never say, you just don't do this to people. Because if the payoff is good, you do it to people. So this is the main problem with utilitarianism, is that utilitarianism fails to protect rights, particularly what we call natural rights. It cannot make sense of these kinds of things.